We can see that it's lots of fun to browse through the Tobey Book. But there's more than entertainment in this document. I want to tell you about one episode I experienced in my genealogy and local history work where information from the Tobey Book was critical. On page 13, we see this item about the boundary between the old Crammy and Murray townships. But as an avid genealogist, my attention focused on the name at the bottom. Who was this Edward Goodyear? Do I have that name in Trees by Dan? Well, I looked, and I had no Goodyears at all. This is very curious, so I made a mental note. Then on page 48, we see this little sketch about the Brighton area dealing with the issue of the concession labels. It shows concession A and B are from the old Murray Township to the east, and concession 1 or 2 are from the old Crammy Township to the west. Down at the left corner, there's a list of lots and owners for concession 2. Lot 1, Edward Goodyear. Lot 2, Josiah Proctor. Lot 4, Obadiah Simpson. There's that name again. We know the name Josiah Proctor and Obadiah Simpson because their families grew and stayed in the area. But who is this Edward Goodyear? This is starting to feel like a challenge. Then, on page 51, I saw this. The memory of Edward Goodyear is perpetuated by the fact that he was one of the men who, by canoe, piloted the Duke of Kent on his visit to Canada and Presqu'île. This referenced a very important event in Canadian history. The Constitution Act of 1791 divided the old province of Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada. A member of the royal family was in Quebec at the time, so he was sent to visit Newark, the first capital of the new Upper Canada. This trip from Quebec to Newark happened in August of 1792. But that leaves the question, is this the same Edward Goodyear that was referenced in previous items in the Tobey Book? My next step was to look at land records, because many items in the Tobey Book related Edward Goodyear to Lot 1, Concession 2, Crammy Township. Next, I opened onland.com, the Ontario Land Property Records portal. This is a fairly recent development, and it is extremely useful in my work. Very quickly, I was able to find the page for Lot 1, Concession 2, Crammy Township. Of course, we always must remember that Brighton Township wasn't created until 1852, so in these early years, we are talking Crammy Township. The first line on this page clearly shows that Edward Goodyear obtained the patent from the Crown in 1803 for all 200 acres of Lot 1, Concession 2. This is the land west of Yonge Street, north of Main, over to Platt Street, and all the way north to the next concession line, which today would be the Little Lake Road. In the following lines, Edward Goodyear sold the land to John Nix in 1811 and then soon bought it back. Then starting in 1816, Edward Goodyear Jr. is involved in land transactions with his father, which would eventually see the west half of the lot sold to Thomas D. Sanford and the east half of the lot sold to John Singleton. The important point to draw from these records is that Edward Goodyear Sr. and Edward Goodyear Jr. were engaged in these transactions at the same time. This raises a lot of questions. Did they actually live there? If so, for how long? And more importantly, are they connected to any other families in the area? Well, new information like this always raises more questions. So it was time to look at Ancestry.ca to see if there was information in family trees that have been created by other researchers that might be useful. Over several days, I found numerous family trees that contained people connected to Edward Goodyear Sr. and his son Edward Jr. And the details were most interesting. Don't try to read this in any detail or you'll get a headache. This is the Edward Goodyear page in my database, so you can see I was able to find a good deal of information about him. I found that Edward Goodyear was born in 1761 in Fairfield County, Connecticut. As a 20-year-old, he spent about a year in a non-combat role during the war, and then he was married a few years after the end of the war in 1786. He and his wife, Abigail Atwater, had 6 children, including Edward Jr., born in 1789. That story of Edward Goodyear paddling the Duke of Kent to Newark in 1792, along with all of this other family information, suggests that Edward Goodyear may have worked for several years after the war in the north on St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario. It was not uncommon at that time for young men from the U.S. states to come north for employment because the British paid pretty well for canoemen and bateaumen on the St. Lawrence River. They would work there on the water in the summer and then head back to their homes in the U.S. in the winter for family matters. Then in 1799, Edward Goodyear's wife divorced him. Divorce was not very common in those days, but there's an actual document in the archives to confirm this one. We must assume that something very serious happened to result in formal divorce. We might expect that at some point, Edward Goodyear abandoned his family in Connecticut and at some point simply didn't return from Upper Canada. It's hard to say at this point, but it looks like the motivation that he had for making his home in Upper Canada had more to do with employment and preference than politics. Certainly, we can't call Edward Goodyear a loyalist because he fought for the Patriots' side during the war. But his work in the colonies after the war provided the British authorities with enough reason to provide him with a crown patent, and he acquired the land right here in Cramie Township. But it was an unusual circumstance for the time. We are lucky to have census and assessment records for Murray and Cramie Township from 1803. When I began to do genealogy work seriously, I printed all of these records for Cramie and Murray so that I would have the information close at hand when the need came up. This is one of the last purely paper collections that I use routinely. It just seems more convenient in paper form. As we can see here, Edward Goodyear is the third name down on the second page of the Cramie census for 1803. In the columns to the right, we can see that the household contained 1 male over 16, 1 female over 16, and 2 males under 16. We can take it from this that Edward Goodyear had a new family in Upper Canada in 1803, although I haven't been able to determine the names of these other folks yet. Census records for subsequent years show that Edward Goodyear is in Cramie Township until around 1820. His son, Edward Goodyear Jr., grew up in Connecticut and married there and was raising a family. Then in 1816, he brought his family to visit his father in Cramie Township, and they stayed for a couple of years, long enough to complete the sale of Lot 1, Concession 2 for his father. Then he returned to New York State and settled in Camden in St. Lawrence County, a little east of Syracuse. After that, Edward Goodyear Sr. is seen in Murray Township census records, a little east of where he earlier lived, around where ENSS is today. The last occurrence of his name in Murray Township census records is in 1836. So we can assume that he passed away in 1836 or 1837 in his mid-70s. But there's more. On page 74 of the Tobey Book, there is a letter. It is dated August 30th, 1820, and it was written by Edward Goodyear, Jr. to his father. These men were engaged in real estate wheeling and dealing, and this letter deals very much with collection of debts. He writes, "To your advantage, I have made a trade with the bearer of this letter, Mr. David N. Castle, and got a small place from him in this town." David Castle had come from Connecticut and settled in Camden, New York, just recently. And we can see by this wording that he was delivering the letter to Edward Goodyear, Sr. in Cranby Township. In fact, other people in Cranby Township are mentioned in the letter. "Short has paid you what is due altogether likely." Now this may refer to Charles Short, who was a well-known settler in the south end of Cranby at this time. "Please spur up Doolittle to fulfill his payments." This likely refers to Titus Doolittle, who was an early settler at Cranby as well. Mr. Kingsbury probably refers to Daniel Kingsbury, who had brought his young family from Connecticut to settle at Cranby, and they stayed long enough for daughters to marry local boys and make connections in the community. Sanford probably refers to Thomas D. Sanford, with whom they'd been doing real estate deals. Ward likely refers to Thomas Ward, who was a lawyer that lived at Presqu'île and would later settle at Port Hope. Then he mentions Richard Loomis and his brothers, who were another Connecticut family. Richard, Levi, and Chester Loomis settled just west of what is Orland today in 1817. More than 20 years ago, I skimmed over this letter in the Tobey Book. But when I came across it again in 2020 in the context of this presentation, it jumped out of the page at me. It's one more reason why I am so grateful for the Tobey Book. And with all of this, Edward Goodyear, one of the earliest settlers in this area, is now documented in Trees by Dan. And that makes me very happy.